because it's a really important book. So we're going to talk about it. So the first book that I finished for the semester was actually for my Southern Lit seminar class, and it's The House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. I've read a little bit of him before. For the previous Southern Lit class that I took, we read parts of The Conjure Woman and The Wife of His Youth and Other Stories, which are two short story anthologies that he published before this, which was his first novel. I really like Charles Chesnutt. I know a lot about him, but I made some notes because I want to make sure I kind of keep things orderly, and give you a brief bit of biography about him before I tell you about the actual book. Charles Chesnutt was from Ohio, but he was also raised in North Carolina. He taught at what would be Fayetteville State University. It was the normal school in Fayetteville when he taught there. And he published two anthologies before publishing The House Behind the Cedars in 1900. Most of his work explained complex race relations. He was very interested in how people would need to identify themselves after slavery and how we go about being better than what we were. Most of the stories in The Conjure Woman focus on John and Annie, who come from up north down south and are told by an Uncle Julius figure who, in kind of funny, outlandish tales, tells them of things that happened during slavery that shouldn't be repeated. And it was a way to kind of slyly teach people about this stuff. He got past white audiences and white critics really well. He was very popular. And then he published The House Behind the Cedars. And The House Behind the Cedars also deals with race relations, but in a lot more of a direct fashion. The House Behind the Cedars is about a man named John Walden who, because of laws in North Carolina, had to identify as African American even though he was only 1/8 African American. He moves to South Carolina where that rule does not apply, and he passes himself off as a white man. At the beginning of this novel, he is going home on a whim and sees his mom and his sister. He realizes that his sister, Rena, can also pass for white and offers her the opportunity to come with him to South Carolina to live, be educated, and live as a white woman. Now identifying as John and Rowena Warwick, most of their problems arise when John's friend George falls in love with Rena and wants to marry her. Rena is torn between knowing that she's lying about her race and not knowing if George will care about it, and not wanting to cause drama. The book is very tense because you do not know when and if George will find out that these two characters are not white. I'm not going to go into great detail on the actual plot of this novel other than the fact that it is in kind of the romantic period of writing and would be classified as a tragedy. It deals with a lot of stereotypes of passing literature, and there's actually a lot of critics that think that maybe Chesnutt was trying to appeal too much to white audiences with this. But there's a fair amount of realism in it too, because he was kind of at the forefront of that movement. He definitely merges this better in his next novel, The Morrow of Tradition, which is also amazing and I highly recommend it. And that one is based on the Wilmington race riots in North Carolina. It was adapted in 1927 into a silent film, which has since been lost. There were significant revisions done to it. The ending is completely different. And that film was even re-edited into a small amount of footage that they have now that is still very different than the novel. It's never been faithfully adapted. I think this is a very important book to read. I think all of Charles Chesnutt's books are important to read, and read, essays written about them, because it was a very pivotal time for him to be writing and be publishing with major publishing houses, because he was a mixed race author and because he primarily wrote about African Americans in America. It's very important to note also that he could have passed. I mean, he easily could have gone somewhere where no one knew him and he could have passed for white, but he chose not to. So there's a little bit of, his real life struggle, I think, in the two characters representing the two options he had, because Rena makes different decisions than John does. And as some would argue, that she doesn't get as many choices because of her gender. I think in the end, if you're a fan of classic novels, or whatever we've decided classic novels are, you'll like this. It's written very well. It flows really nice through the different plot points. you think John is the protagonist when you start this, but he's clearly not. And about halfway through it does the switch, and you realize that actually it's important that you know what Rena is feeling and doing. And I think that's very important too, that he chose to tell this story from a female's perspective, more or less. It should be pretty easy to find and pretty cheap. And if you like it, I highly suggest you read his other things. The Conjure Woman stories are really quick reads, but if you kind of pay attention, you'll realize what's being said. The Moral of Tradition is heartbreaking, but it is very important still, even now in 2019, to read that. I think at the end of the day, I'm pretty excited that this was the first book I got to read, because I already knew I liked Charles Chestnut, and now I found another book by him that I like. I'm sad I can never read it for the first time again, if that makes sense, because there's so much build up to certain things, and the tension is real. I just actually finished the second novel for that class, and I'm working on my third for another class, and we'll hopefully have a review up for one of those next week. I liked the second one for this class okay, but when you start off with Charles Chestnut, it's hard to reach that level for me again. But I hope this has been fun. It's important to show that even if you go to school for English or English education, that you're not necessarily just reading like old dead white guys. Like, I've read plenty of them, trust me, in my Brit Lit classes. But sometimes you get gems like this, like you get Charles Chestnut, the African American writer from North Carolina, writing about African American issues. Sometimes you luck out, I guess. But read this book, seriously. Serious note, please read this book.